With the first pick.
All righty, welcome to On the Clock. On the Clock's presented by our friends at Titan Bat Company. If you're looking for the highest quality handcrafted wood bats in the game, Titan Bats has you covered with premium maple, ash, and birch game bats in 10 different models and colors to fit your swing and style. As you're gearing up for the spring season, Titan Bats is the perfect option for your next wood bat. In addition to game bats ranging from youth baseball to softball to men's baseball, Titan Bats also offers award bats that make the perfect gift to celebrate a teammate, coach, or baseball fan in your life. So check them out at titanbats.com and take your game to the next level this season. All righty, it's Monday, February 3rd. I'm Jared. That's Tyler. We got Jason Ratcliff with us from 64 Analytics to talk a little college baseball. It's almost college baseball season. We're about less than 2 weeks away, and we have our top 25 college team rankings that just came out. The preseason All-Americans that are coming out Tuesday morning. So, yeah, excited to dive into this a little bit. But Jason, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us, man.
Doing well. It's a lovely day here in Houston. We've broken out of the cold, so the sun is back, and we're back to some lovely weather.
Yeah, we're all excited to get down to Texas. I think all three of us will be at Shriners to kick off the college baseball season. But let's dive into the top 25. I'll read through here kind of the first 10 just so everybody who's listening has an idea. It's Texas A&M, Tennessee, Virginia, LSU, Arkansas, Florida State, Clemson, Oregon State, Georgia, and Duke rounds out the top 10. So let's just dive into this a little bit. For you, Jason, which team kind of surprises you the most on our top 10? Who are you kind of looking at as the potential surprise?
Potential surprise for me, a team in the top 10 that maybe, I don't trust, maybe Oregon State. So a little bit of an oddity this year is they're actually going to be a D1 independent. So with the Pac-12 kind of dissolving completely from a baseball perspective, they don't really have a conference schedule.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a conference schedule. You look at your top 25, they only have 8 games all year, first top 25 opponents. Now, their first 3 weekends, they have those round robin tournaments, which is pretty abnormal. Most teams have 1, 2, but they don't really have, I think, maybe besides Ava Arquette, like a big time player on their squad. Like Caraway is a guy that's listed a lot of times of having this really high potential. But I feel like a lot of that's more subjectivity rather than like objectivity. Because as a freshman, he only played like a dozen or so games, 10, 12, something like he got injured. He had decent numbers in the Cape, but you look around, some outlets have him as like a top 5 third baseman, and the thought is like not really sure where ultimately that's coming from. Almost a little bit of a crystal ball analysis. They lose Bazana. They have like one arm coming back, Segura. He had really good numbers as a true freshman, but about like a 5 ERA-ish. But again, no conference schedule, no real like ace that kind of jumps out. Like, can they make it to Omaha, where basically they're kind of scripted as being one of those potential top 8 seeds if they're not hosting a super regional?
Yeah.
Like, where do they fit?
Yeah. And Tyler, are you in agreement with that? Is Oregon State kind of your team, or you got somebody else?
No, I think mine would be Oregon State. And like, I think Jason nailed it on the head. Like, Arquette's obviously the big name there. Caraway, we only got like, it was like 12, 15 games, I think, because it was like a hand injury that kept him out from like March until super regionals, basically. And like Gavin Turley too, like we talk about Turley a lot, between us, and this is a guy that's got 5-tool potential. He just hasn't hit ever since high school. So there's a lot of question marks to kind of be answered on that front for me. And like, kind of looking at the rotation too, like Leif Palmer didn't really pitch a ton last year. Dax Whitney is their prize prospect that came in from high school this past year, but obviously hasn't pitched at this big of a scale yet. Segura, had his struggles last year, and I like Segura a lot. Like just watching him on the USA team this year, like I think that's the kind of stuff that you see maybe, pop up, like not like a Jamie Arnold kind of pop up, but like I could totally see Segura being like a guy that vaults himself into like top 5 pitcher on the West Coast kind of guy.
Yeah.
And then you look at like Nelson Keljo, who I don't know if he's going to be in the rotation. I think he's probably better off as being like a long relief or even their closer this year. But outside of that, there's not a ton of like big definitive arms that have big roles put in yet. So it's a lot of question marks to be answered for me. And like Jason mentioned, that schedule, it's really tough on them. Like I know they got a really good matchup against Nebraska and that I'm looking forward to because I think Nebraska could be a really sneaky good team. But outside of that, like there's just being an independent is so tough right now.
Yeah.
And with the way that they're going to have to be traveling around, it's going to take a toll on the team, I think. So we'll see what happens. But for me right now, it's Oregon State.
Yeah, and I mean, so I'm probably in agreement with both of you on Oregon State as well, but I picked Virginia just to kind of be a little bit different. They're number 3 on our rankings. For me, it's not so much that I don't trust the team. I definitely would trust them more than like an Oregon State, but because the lineup's absolutely loaded, right? You got 2 potential like top MLB draft picks in Henry Ford and Henry Gobbo kind of leading that offense. That doesn't even include like Eric Becker in the leadoff spot, potentially James Nunnally, who can also hit at the top of that lineup, who's a freshman that was drafted by the Milwaukee Brewers. Like, and then you have like Chris Arroyo, Jacob Ferentz, Harrison Didowick, and all these other guys who are just going to kind of round out that lineup. Like it's absolutely stacked. And then Jason was talking about it before the podcast. So it's like the top 4 might be the best top 4 in all of college baseball. The question marks for me come with the pitching staff, right? I watched them this fall, and so they may have taken like a 6-0, 7-0 lead on Maryland, and then the pitching staff all of a sudden just gave up that lead like in the next inning. So they have a lot of question marks. Like they have Jay Woolfolk coming back for his senior year. He is what he is, right? Like he had average numbers last year, really kind of showed up in the playoffs, and it was just like absolute bulldog during the playoffs and really helped them get to the College World Series. But they at least have a Friday night guy in Evan Blanco who's going to be the ace for them. He was 8-3 with a 3.62 ERA last year, and he kind of took everything to another level, especially in the second half of the season. So. But then outside of those guys, like you have Bryson Moore, William Kirk, a bunch of other guys who like have flash potential, but like they're just still super young or unpolished. And so I don't know how much I quite trust that pitching staff yet.
I agree with your Virginia analysis. I mean, they lost 2 of their best bullpen arms to the portal, Hungate and McKay. So I think Hungate went to Mississippi State and McKay went to Coastal Carolina, if I remember correctly. And I think if you kind of look at just where they sat from kind of almost a projection of their pitching, their hitting was clearly one of the top 5 teams in Division I this year, but their pitching just really didn't meet that mark. They're pretty much like 60th to 70th percentile, and your OPS allowed, your strikeout percentages, strikeout per walk. So to lose, maybe about 50% of that production that already wasn't really providing, if you get past those first few arms, like what do you have? And they may score 9 runs a game, but they also may need to.
Yeah. Tyler, do you have any thoughts before we kind of move on?
I was thinking of like making a comparison for that Virginia lineup, especially the top end. So I'm kind of bringing it up here, but like Tennessee last year had their entire top 5, I'm pretty sure, got drafted. If I remember, like Christian Moore obviously was the big catalyst on that offense. He went 8th to the Angels. But then you kind of look farther down, like Blake Burke was a comp pick. Billy Amick was a 2nd rounder. Kavaris Tears was in the 3rd or 4th round. Dylan Dreiling was a 2nd rounder. And then you have Dean Curley after that to kind of like be that middle of the lineup guy that could still, give you offense as a freshman in the SEC. So like you start looking at that Virginia line, you kind of see similarities. Like Jacob Ferentz is back. You mentioned the 2 Henrys. Nunnally, Aiden Teal's back, Harrison Didowick's back. So kind of just looking at that, that's like the first comparison I can make is that Tennessee lineup from last year.
Yeah. And they're going to have guys like who are studs that aren't even going to play. Like Aiden Harris went to campus. Like they just have all these dudes that are just going to be hanging out on the bench. bat-wise. It's nuts. Next, I kind of want to get into the number one team, Texas A&M. Tyler, I think I know your answer to this question already. So, Jason, I'm going to start with you. Is Texas A&M the number one team for you?
I'm going to go ahead and say something that probably isn't in agreement with most individuals, and I'll say no. So for me, it's LSU. Two Team USA infielders and Milan and Dickinson. Jared Jones, I think, is like plus 1,500 for the Golden Spikes Award. You probably have the best concentration of freshman class in the country with 3 top 15 guys all making the campus. Ambide, Schmidt, Gurriel. Top of that, you've got like one of your best bullpen arms in Guidry. Shores is coming back from being injured. I mean, I really, honestly, I don't see a hole on LSU. It's very similar to Texas A&M. Texas A&M, I wonder about like pitching depth. Their hitting, I think, will be a Virginia-esque like hitting team. But I don't know like if they have a 7th through 10th arm, kind of like an LSU has. I mean, 2 of our top 20 portal guys, Jacob Myers and Dalton Beck, I mean, are very similar to what you said. Like they're searching for playing time right now.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an exceptionally deep team. I think if you look at 1 through 11, like, position players, I think it's A&M because they just don't have any sort of let up in that lineup. But I do think if LSU's arms begin to meet their expectations, combined with their power ability, that to me, they're the team that has the most well-rounded group. So I think you're really getting between very small differences. Like any of these like top 5 or so teams, you can make a very strong argument whether they're number one. And I think there's an exceptionally strong argument for Texas A&M to be a number one. But if someone asked me, hey, who's your number one, I'd have to go LSU.
Yeah, Tyler and I were actually talking about this kind of earlier when we were interviewing Jay Johnson. Like I remember getting prepped for that interview and like going through the roster, and I was like, I did not realize how deep this team was. Like I knew it was deep and talented, but then when you actually like take the time to go through like piece by piece, it was like, this is insane. I think the only reason I put them at 3 is like there's so much talent there. I'm like, how long is it going to take for them to figure out like who's going to be the guys, right? Like I know they've had the fall to kind of like suss some of that out, but like it takes time to figure out like who are going to be your guys, who are going to be the go-tos, who are going to be able to perform at that level, especially with a lot of freshmen. Even though how highly talented they are, they got to adjust to SEC play as freshmen. So I think that's my biggest concern with them, but I can't disagree with you at all in terms of like that might be one of the most loaded teams in college baseball.
I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but you guys have Zach Cowan as one of your, I think, your 3rd team All-American. And the question is like, what's his position right now on the team?
Yeah.
Like, is he a weekend starter? Like where is he? Like, I mean, he could very easily only get, 30, 40 innings pitched. It's almost similar to like that 21 or 22 Tennessee team where they just seem to have 8 to 10 guys that all threw between like 30 to 50 innings pitched. Just so deep, so talented that they almost don't have one individual who's throwing like 80 plus innings pitched and just dominating every weekend.
Yeah. Tyler, I want to go over to you because I believe on your personal rankings, you had Tennessee as one. Talk a little bit about that and the reasoning for that. As you kind of talked about, that they lost so many guys in the draft, but they still seem to kind of reload and be one of the top teams again.
Yeah, and like again, the entire top 5 of that lineup was drafted last year, so they're missing a lot of firepower from a team that won the national championship. But you get Hunter Ensley back, who's going to be the sole leader of that lineup. One of the better older guys in the country. I want to say he's like a 5th-year senior or something like that. Not to mention, they did really good in the portal as well. Like they were kind of like a late bloomer a little bit. Like we mentioned that the last time we had you on, Jason. But like immediately after that, Gavin Keelan commits to Rocky Top. Andrew Fisher goes to Rocky Top. William Doyle is now joining. So, you look at that, and that's 3 big names in the portal that have now instantly put their way in. And now you're getting potentially some solidification at first base with Alberto Ozuna, who, thanks to Diego Pavia's ruling a couple months ago,
that's crazy,
is no longer at Tampa. He's now going to be joining Tennessee with 2 weeks to go before the season starts. And that's a big time power bat to add to your lineup too. And it was kind of like a question mark originally at first base with Dalton Bargo potentially being the guy there. He was a Mizzou transfer a couple years ago. But like just looking at what they have, you never question Frank Anderson's pitching because Frank Anderson is just one of the best pitching coaches in college baseball. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And yes, they don't have AJ Russell to start the year. He's coming back halfway through the year is what we've heard. But you still have like Nate Snead jumping from closer to starter and has refined his pitch mix. Brandon Arvidsson comes from JUCO. He's going to probably be the third guy in the lineup on the weekend. Marcus Phillips is going to be your closer now, potentially. And Marcus Phillips had really big stuff last year. You know, Doyle probably scoots in as your Friday guy because he has that SEC experience. But then you also got the freshman to come in. Like Tegan Kuhns might be your midweek starter who could
I was going to mention.
Get pushed into like a either a weekend spot or even just like a heavily used bullpen arm. So there's depth here. I think there's still a lot of firepower. Plus, you add in guys like Jay Abernathy, who's potentially going to be top of that lineup as a freshman. Reese Chapman's going to get his first chance to be like a full-time player this year. I'm excited to see what he can do because he was highly touted as a high school senior out of Colorado, I do believe. So, kind of just seeing what they have. Like Dean Curley's back. You add that kind of firepower in the portal. Have the pitching. It's tough for me to kind of look at this and go like, hey, they just won the national championship and then reloaded. It's tough for me to not put the national champion at one, but you know, it's tough at the top. Like A&M's loaded. LSU you mentioned is another team that kind of shocked me when we looked at it. And Virginia, of course, having that kind of lineup. But that's just where I'm at with Tennessee. I'm definitely probably the high guy in college baseball Twitter, but it's just hard to ignore the kind of the stuff that they've brought to the table the past few years, plus just how good of a coach Vitello is and the coaching staff behind him to kind of just clear everything out with Elander and Anderson. So it's just really tough for me to quit that team.
And I mean, a guy you didn't mention, Kenneth Peebles, like that's a guy who like Cape Cod, they love him. And so like I agree with you. I think we had them too. So I mean, while yes, they lose a lot, there are teams who go out and they just get, you know, what feels like a third of their roster from the portal every year. They get 4 to 5 guys that fill the gaps that they need. And then they utilize, you know, high school and, as you said, JUCO for kind of the meat of their lineup. And I really feel like with Osuna coming in, which is wild. I was looking at the D2 scoreboards on Friday, and I was like, Osuna's not in the lineup. Like Lunny from Kansas, who also made that shift from D1 to D2 because of the extra year. And I didn't see Osuna. I was like, oh, goodness, is he going to be able to find a spot? And I think it broke Saturday night that he was going to Tennessee. So the fact that, I mean, you talk about Tennessee has some bats, but that is also a hitter-friendly ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
And the exit velos that Osuna puts up, he's not going to need a hitter-friendly ballpark. That he's going to hit it pretty far. But yeah, that lineup, they had all of those 105 plus exit velos. It felt like every weekend you'd go there. It felt like 1 through 8. It was just wild to see them hit. And my assumption is, as you said, they won't skip a beat.
Yeah,
Ozuna's going to put one into the river behind left field, man. I swear.
Yeah.
Not to go into a tangent on it soon and get off soft track, but like I saw someone tweet out that he's like ditching his team in the middle of the season. Like, how could he do this? I was like, he didn't have that opportunity to go to Tennessee before he committed to Tampa. Like, if this rule was in place before this, like that he had committed to Tampa, he wouldn't have been going to Tampa.
I know for a fact that there's one Division I team that was quite unhappy with themselves that they didn't keep the possibility of one of their members going back down to D2. So this is one of the things where everyone's just kind of trying to see what the NCAA is going to do next. And this is just one of those things that's unfortunate that it happened so close to the season. But I mean, everyone, if they were given an opportunity for a better job, would generally take that job. And so this is just another situation where nothing against Tampa, phenomenal program, but you were talking about Tennessee, who just won the national championship. That's clearly
Talking about getting eyeballs on you, right? Go to the University of Tampa versus going to the University of Tennessee.
Exactly.
For me, I picked the Texas A&M Aggies as my number one team. Just because to me, I look at teams that just came so close to winning it all, right, and having that chip on your shoulder, and then Texas A&M has that from last season. Then they go into this offseason, lose their head coach, Jim Schlossnagle, to Texas. Everybody enters the portal. You're kind of like, okay, what's going to happen to Texas A&M? They get their guy Mike Early to become the head coach, bring all their guys back, basically, and they're fully loaded. They have guys like Ryan Prager, who got drafted by the Angels, who still came back to campus. Like, this team's just absolutely loaded. They're highlighted by Jace Laviolette as the number one. He's like the number one overall prospect for the 2025 MLB Draft. They got Graham Grohovic, who was the SEC Freshman of the Year. They brought in Gavin Cash. I mean, this team is just stacked, and I think they're going to have a chip on their shoulder, and that's kind of why I put them at number one. Tyler, what are your thoughts on Texas A&M?
Hashtag loaded is probably the best way to put it. They might just end up having the best outfield in college baseball this year, with Jace obviously being the primary guy, but like Caden Sorrell he turned heads last year as a freshman in the SEC, and I think he's in for a big sophomore year as well. Grohovic is another guy that also was going to have a ton of firepower to top that lineup. It's really, really deep. It's really, really good. Not to mention, like, you don't have Shane Sadeo this year, unfortunately, because of injury. Like, he had that elbow injury against Oregon in the Super Regionals, wasn't able to pitch this fall, and he had Tommy John in September, I do believe. But they still got a really good and experienced pitching staff. Like you mentioned Prager coming back. That's the big, big win for them. And then you got guys like Weston Moss in the bullpen that can really turn into a rotation guy this year. Lampkin's still there. He can be a really, really good starter for them if he figures it out this year. So I still put them as, like, I kind of wonder some of the smaller role guys, like some of the new freshmen that came in. I think trying to remember his name. Is Sawyer Farr, I think, is the guy that I kind of wonder how big of a role does he have moving forward with Texas A&M. So kind of just seeing, like, the depth. I'm not ruling it out that there's some depth issues there. At least for me, that's probably why I put them at 2. But it's still like I don't have any quarrels with them being the first overall team in the country,
Jason, I was going to ask you, just because I know Gavin Cash was pretty high on your portal rankings. He's Big 12 Player of the Year. Talk a little bit about him and kind of what he brings to this team too.
Yeah, no. So it was interesting because they already had 2 corner infield spots, Bergevin and Hensler. I think they're going to move him to second base, if I remember correctly. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. They already had, 2 to 3 really good bats. And the thought was, when they got Cash, because he was one of their last portal pickups, was, where's he going to play? So I think there was a potential, like, hey, he may want to see how he can do in left field, like a corner outfield spot. But you just mentioned Sorrell. Like, I think it'll be really interesting to see who gets that last corner outfield spot, that first base spot, and the DH spot for them. Because in my opinion, even catcher. They got Galloway, I think, from USC, and Bear Harrison, the catcher from St. Mary's. I mean, they have a couple of really interesting battles at positions, but it's not as if it's this is just our last person and we need to see who's the best last person. No, this is more of, these guys would start on 99% of teams in D1, and how will they do? So I honestly, as an aside, I think this is going to be one of the really unique aspects of this year is, what are some of these players who were top players out of the portal who end up going, Cam Kojal went from Vandy to Arkansas. I don't know if he's got a spot right now. We've already talked about Dalton Beck at LSU. We're talking about Gavin Cash now. I mean, these guys who kind of left what you could say are pretty green pastures. And, the old saying is, the grass isn't always greener. And ultimately, does the portal kind of create this question mark of, did I jump ship for an opportunity that perhaps wasn't actually there?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Other question I want to get into kind of before we dive into kind of the conferences as well. For you all, which team outside the top 25 do you think could be a surprise Omaha contender? I can give you all a list of some of the teams that were just missed our top 25. You have like Kentucky, Mississippi State, East Carolina, Coastal Carolina, UCSB, Georgia Tech, Nebraska. Those are just a few. Tyler, how about you? Which one do you think has the best chance to make an Omaha run?
UCSB. I'm fully in on that pitching staff, and like Checketts has always been he knows his arms kind of guy. Like it's been long herald how good those arms have been coming out of there. And I think with Tyler Bremner, like you look at that, and really for me, that's some of the best pitchability, not only on the West Coast but in the country. And to pair that with a guy that's got a potential 7 changeup that we've talked about in the past, with a good slider that's taking a step forward, that he has a chance to be the best pitcher in all of college baseball this year with Jamie Arnold. So for me, kind of looking at that, and then the depth too, like Jackson Flora is a guy that really put himself onto the scene last year. Cole Triba is going to be a good back end piece for them. I think Chase Hoover came from TCU, so he's going to have a significant role in that pitching staff as well. And then you kind of just look at the lineup, like Jonathan Mendez is going to get a bigger role this year. Reese Calvin's back, so you have your center field spot kind of locked up with him. And immediately the lineup does give you some question marks for me. Like the corner spots kind of wondered. They got 2 transfers in. I think it was like Jack Holman and Jeremiah Crane were 2 guys that they're on the older side, but they're like the 2 guys that make the most sense for me to kind of put at those positions. I'd imagine there's some depth issues there, but the outfield's good. But they're going to have the pitching to make a deep run. And for me, like I mentioned with Bremner, like if he performs at the pace that he was last year, I think he struck out 104 in 90 innings with a 2.5 ERA. If he's pitching at a 2 flat ERA across hypothetical 15 starts throughout the year, and he's striking out as much guys as he is and not walking a ton of guys, he is a very tough guy to beat in a regional, and even a super regional if they make it that far. So getting through him, and then just the depth they have behind him is going to be really, really tough. And I think pitching, we mentioned defense wins championships. I think in baseball, the pitching is definitely the defense substitute to making that comparison.
I love that pick. As a West Coast guy, I really love that pick. Jason, who you got?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with the first team you mentioned, Kentucky. I legitimately think this team is one of the most slept on teams in the country. Got one of the biggest surprises to come to campus. I think was he drafted in the 2nd round, and he didn't. I can only imagine how much money he gave up to head to Kentucky, being actually drafted and having that number effectively flashed in front of him. Mingione has been able to do so much in such a short amount of time. 9 guys from the portal of top 300. We talked about some teams get 14, 16 guys. Kentucky's one of them. They get Devin Burks back, probably the emotional leader of the team. They got 8 pitchers from the portal. And then I think something we saw in college football, which we'll probably start to see leak into college baseball this year, is with these super conferences, you're going to have teams that end up having easier conference schedules, would probably be the best way to put it. They miss Arkansas, Florida, and LSU. They go to Georgia, they go to Texas A&M, and they're at Tennessee. But if they win one of those 3, easily could see them being a top 16 seed. And if they're a top 16 seed, easily could see them going to Omaha. So, I get they lost a lot, but I think they've got a lot of momentum, and I really like some of the pieces on their team. They've got a guy from, I think it was Hague. It was from the Ivy League. Yeah, Cole Hague. That guy, it's too bad we can't share like a picture of this. He is jacked out of his mind. I can only wait to see the exit velos he gets up there in Kentucky, because he is a massive human being. They're one of the teams I'm really excited about. It as a individual whose college team generally goes against Kentucky. Sometimes you're not a fan of like seeing all the dancing on second base that they do in between pitches, but also just a fan of the sport. You have to love how much energy they bring to the game. So I'm a big fan of Kentucky and what they'll do this year. And I don't even think they were listed by some outlets as they're like top 10 next. And that for me, I talk about bulletin board material for a team that won 20. I think they won the SEC outright last year, right? Or they
Yeah.
tied for first. For that to happen, and then to
Yeah,
not even be
Lin
considered like
Jones was SEC Coach of the Year because of that
yeah,
too.
like not even a top 30. That for me, I would put that everywhere, like bulletin board material to the max.
Blow that up, put it in the locker room.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Team I went with was Texas Christian University, TCU. That team, like I kind of go back to my theme of having a chip on your shoulder, right? That team started 13-0 last year and then wound up kind of middling the rest of their way through conference play, and then wound up not even making the playoffs. I like that team a lot because they bring a lot of experience back, right? They have a lot of veterans who are on that team and kind of round out that lineup and round out that rotation. They brought in some really good transfers too. Isaac Cadena from Ohio State. They got Jack Bell from Texas A&M. So like they did pretty well in the portal. There's nothing really flashy about this team, right? I feel like it's like a safe floor team rather than like a high upside type team. Not a ton of power in that offense. It's kind of like you need guys like Anthony Silva to really bounce back and kind of have a performance he did his freshman year instead of what he did last year as a sophomore. He like slash 268, 369, 384 with 4 home runs and 33 RBIs. Like he's going to be your leader. Like you got to get more production out of him. So overall, though, I do like this team. It sounds like they're going to try Ben Abel into the rotation to see what he can do. They have Caden Parker, Tommy Lepore, and then they have freshmen like Trevor Baumler, who's going to like potentially be a weekday guy. So I really like this team overall. I think if some of these pieces can really click, they could probably take things to the next level.
Oh yeah, I mean they have my freshman player of the year, Noah Franco.
Yeah.
So
Yep. I
I
forgot about
mean,
Noah Franco.
yeah, he's gonna be legit. And you talk about like a two-way player. I think he was hitting like 98 in their fall from the left side, and he also
Nice.
has just unreal power. So he's a guy. I mean, they basically already have a position that they had. Peyton Tully was doing the exact same thing for them last year. They kind of just found his replacement through the high school. So for me, I think he's going to put up silly numbers in the Big 12. So he's my freshman player of the year.
I love it. Before we dive into the preseason All-Americans, one last quick question for you all. So who is your pick to win it all? Doesn't have to be the team that you put number one. Who do you think? And Tyler, we'll start with you.
This team's State Wolfpack, man. Let me tell you. I'm kidding. To give you like a legitimate answer that's not biased, I want to stay with the ACC because I feel like for me the ACC is very deep this year.
Mm-hmm.
Like Stanford and Cal obviously being added to the mix kind of heightens that a little bit, but Cal admittedly is probably going to be like a back end of the ACC kind of team that like sneaks into the ACC tournament. But like you look at Stanford, and Stanford's returning a ton of their production from last year on both sides of the ball. But kind of moving past that, I wouldn't be shocked if Virginia kind of finally gets rid of that can't win in Omaha label and finds itself at the top of the pile again this year. Not to go back on what we talked about earlier, like that lineup's loaded. Obviously there's questions with pitching, but like I could see Bryson Moore becoming their key sophomore arm this year and kind of stepping up in a big way. And with like Jack O'Connor, which, not his fault, he had an injury last year, but like Jack O'Connor was kind of like the same kind of like, we're really pushing him up here because we think he's really good. And admittedly, O'Connor did struggle in the rotation last year, then got dealt with the injury he had, and he missed the rest of the season. And now he's kind of like out of a role a little bit. But, you get Jay Woolfolk back. I think that's a key piece in the puzzle there in terms of like getting leadership back. You're getting a good experience back as well. So I don't know. Put me in on the Cavaliers. I'm pretty high on that team overall right now.
Yeah, Woolfolk, big clubhouse guy too, like you mentioned. Like that dude, just everybody rallies around that guy. Hey, if you score 15 runs a game, you don't need pitching. So let's just say that they're going to score 15 a game.
I mean, college baseball.
Jason, who's your pick?
I mean, I feel like I'm just throwing things up against the wall and see if they stick. So I'll just have to, stick with LSU.
I love it.
Again, the probably deepest top 14 position play. I mean, again, but how many are those 12 through 14 guys going to play? Not a lot.
Yeah.
But then I think I don't see them losing many midweek games because the depth of their pitching is going to be so absurd. So they're going to have it would be a shock to me if they're not a top 8 national seed. And so if they have the box for both regional and super regional, just with the way the tournament's set up right now, I see them getting to Omaha. And if they get to Omaha, then they've got so much pitching combined with it. They feel to me a lot like Tennessee last year. They really do, of just so almost heads and shoulders above in terms of overall offensive talent. But I don't. It's again 6 one way, half a dozen the other. You could basically copy paste another team for LSU's name and make exactly the same argument.
Yeah, I love it. I'm going to go even further down the list and join Tyler in the ACC, but take Florida State. I think Florida State is a sneaky good team. You got Jamie Arnold, who's probably the best college pitcher right now. You brought in some freshmen like Hunter Carnes and Miles Bailey that are going to really kind of round out that lineup. And I don't know, Jackson West, if like what he did in the fall is like actually going to stick, like that kid's going to be a stud too. And I really like that lineup. And I don't know, I feel like I could easily pick one of the top 5 teams, but I want to go different.
Yeah. No, that's fun. I like it.
Yeah. Let's dive into the preseason All-Americans. So for those of you who are listening, we're not going to run through every single person on the preseason All-American list. You can go to the article, find the full list there, or on Instagram. We got graphics and things like that are out there that you can take a look. But for you all, let's start with the first team preseason All-American list. Out of those players, who do you think ends up being the National Player of the Year? And Jason, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah. I'm gonna go Andrew Fisher. So I know I think he's like 8th or so on the betting sites, but I think I talked to this a little about previously of the box that the stadium for out there in Tennessee being a little hitter friendly, especially right center field where it's like 360 in the gap. I see his left. I think he's going to put up some big numbers. So I know that Laviolette is pretty much as the consensus seen as player of the year, but I do think he'll put up just crazy numbers for the Volunteers.
I love that. That's a solid pick. Tyler, what do you got?
Cam Cannarella, Clemson.
Nice.
I'm gonna be a bit ballsy here, but when you look at what he did last year, and especially like towards the end of the year, like he's playing really, really well down the stretch. Had that iconic play in center field to kind of save them a little bit in Supers against Florida, but he was doing all of that with essentially a torn labrum in his shoulder. They've been pretty open about the fact that he couldn't run the bases last year because of the fact that he couldn't physically slide because everything was so jammed up in there, and he got surgery this offseason. So I can totally see a fully healthy Cannarella just have an absolutely mammoth year for Clemson. He was kind of showing it last year where he started to pull the ball more. He started to lift the ball in the air more. But I also do kind of wonder if like the shoulder injury kind of hampered him from really tapping fully into his power. So I could totally see him having a power uptick and the field of hits there. Maybe a bit more aggressive than we're kind of used to. Like as a freshman, he didn't chase a ton, but last year he did. But again, you pair that with like premium center field defense. I could totally see this kid essentially becoming the best in the entire country above Laviolette. And for me, I wouldn't even rule out him being like the first overall pick. if he comes out like that. So, kind of tying in some draft stuff there. But for me, I really do like the way that Canarello plays the game. He plays it with fire. He plays it with flair. And just having him healthy this year is going to be a big, big piece for Clemson.
I love that. I'm going to be boring and pick Jace Laviolette.
Boo.
It's a good pick. It's a good pick.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. 305, 449, 726, 29 home runs, 78 RBIs last year. I'm just going to, and like insane exit velos. It's dumb.
And
I'm
you
picking
have to
Jace.
pitch to him. You have to pitch to him. Like
Yep.
you can't pitch around him.
Nope.
Yeah.
They even tried when like Jack Cag was at Florida to pitch around him, and they still had to find ways to pitch to him. Yeah. It's college baseball. So other thing I want to get into on the first season or first preseason All-American team, Tyler, for you, we know like Jamie Arnold and Tyler Bremer are like the easy 1-2 pitchers of college baseball this year. But on the first team All-American list, who's another guy that like you're watching? They're like, okay, this guy could make a push to be like one of the top 3.
Gabe Gackle for sure. Kind of looking at what he was as a senior in high school, like he was kind of sitting in the mid 90s, shorter guy, wasn't really filled out all that much. Gets to campus and now he's chucking like fuzzballs at 99 with 2 hammer breaking balls and feel for a changeup. And I think this year he's going to be put into a starting role. So just seeing the kind of stuff that he has with command and just the overall mechanics to kind of work as a starter for right now. I would not be shocked if he's not only the Friday guy at Arkansas, who, Arkansas is loaded with pitching depth as always. But I could totally see him just being the best pitcher in the SEC. I wouldn't be shocked if he usurps Prager as the pitcher of the year in the SEC. I would not be shocked.
I love that. That's a great pick. Jason, for you on the offensive side, who's a guy that stands out to you? Like we know we got Jace Laviolette and Tyler talked about Cam Canarella, but is there a guy you think that doesn't get talked about enough on this first season, our first team All-American team?
It's kind of a he does and he doesn't is Ike Irish. So this is a guy as like a freshman out of Auburn. Everyone was like, okay, he's the guy. He's that like top 5 pick. Everyone was like, maybe he'll be a number 1 pick. Is he going to play catcher? Is he going to play outfield? What's his position? And it's not like he even had a down year. You look at his BABIP compared to just his actual stats. He had horrible BABIP luck. Like I think there was only a difference of like 10 points between his average and his BABIP. So any ball he put in play, it was basically like you're gonna be out unless it was just a rocket. So I mean he's one of the guys I think really takes a jump this year. And honestly, I'm intrigued to see what position he plays because they got the switch hitter from I think it was Sanford, Lucas Steele, out of the portal from catcher. And I remember reaching out to some of my Auburn contacts and being like, well, what does this mean for Ike Irish? And they're like, oh, well, he's going to find a position and maybe outfield. Like, where is it going to be? I think he sees that kind of, if I prove that I can do this in the outfield, I can really improve my stock as well. And I think Auburn, they have a bounce back season with him, McMurray. They got the number 1 portal guy, Fisher as well, another Fisher. So I really feel like he has the opportunity. I mean, he's first team. Clearly, he's being talked about a lot, but I think he's one of those individuals who's kind of been passed over by the Canarellas, by the Burrises, by the Laviolettes because they exceeded even their sophomore expectations. Where it's not like he didn't do well. He just didn't go crazy like they did.
Yeah, I love that pick. Before we kind of go on to the second preseason All-American team, Tyler, is anyone else you want to touch on this list?
I'd probably say like Matt Scott at Stanford. Again, we've talked about Stanford being loaded. They're returning a lot of guys. Matt Scott's the biggest piece of that, in my opinion. And looking at the stuff that he has, I wouldn't be shocked if he's a potential first rounder as well. Like has a fastball that has a ton of carry upstairs, and just obviously the big thing with him is obviously pitching. He's like it creates that angle to the plate. Hitters see that, they kind of light him up there. So I wonder, improve command, start throwing it on the top rail, starts missing more bats. You pair that with the slider and the splitter he's got. I wouldn't be shocked if he's ACC Pitcher of the Year when all is said and done. So he's a guy that I'm just hoping that if Stanford lets him kind of toy with his locations in the strike zone instead of just pitching directly at the knees, like I could totally see him just finding a whole nother gear in terms of just how he pitches and how good of an arm that he is.
I love that. Going on to the second preseason All-American team. Jason, I'll start with you here. Just looking at this list, is there a guy on this list that you think could easily make a push for the first team All-American list?
Aiden Knack for Clemson. You look at him, he went crazy. I think he had like a 10 strikeout game. Maybe he was first Wake Forest. I'm trying to remember which game it was. His changeup is elite. Like the arm side run on his changeup is just silly. And then he throws a mid-90s fastball. And this was all as a true freshman. So, I mean, you look at some of the true freshman pitchers last year, like Dominic Vagley at Kansas. You had Knack at Clemson. Gackle, we've already talked about Arkansas. There was some really good upper end pitching, but he was the best. So you look at from a numbers perspective, he was the number one freshman pitcher last year in the country, and he did it for an elite team. So for me, he's a guy that can very, very easily jump into that first team.
I love that pick. I will say I did have him on my first team All-American list, blaming Peyton and Monty for the Aiden Knack being on the second team. Because Tyler, I think you might have had him too.
Maybe. It's been so long since we actually filled those out. I can't even remember, but I know I put him on there somewhere.
Yeah. Tyler, how about you? Who's a guy on this list that you think could jump up to first team?
Merrick Houston.
That's gonna be my pick.
Nice.
Yep. Sniped you, buddy. Just with Merrick himself, like he did take that next step last year as a sophomore, and coming into the year, like the biggest thing obviously is power. Like we all kind of saw it last year. It's like 30 grade power. Obviously really, really good hit tool, knows how to play defense. He's one of the best shortstops I've seen in my time scouting. And he's probably just the best defender in the ACC completely. But this year he came in, he's bigger, and the ball does fly at Wake Forest. That is not a pitcher-friendly ballpark at all. And during fall ball, he was putting charges into balls. He was hit, like BPs were pretty impressive from him. So for me, if he's able to get more into that power this year, maybe even get to like 40 grade, I think he's going to find a way to be a first team All-American at the end of the year. And I'm hoping that there is a big gold glove ready for him at the end of the year, because my man is just absolutely amazing at shortstop.
Yeah, I love that pick. I was going to go, since you took Merrick, maybe Devin Taylor, but now I'm going to switch it up to Chris Arroyo as the two-way player. Just what I saw him at the plate this fall was just really impressive. He absolutely mashed his baseballs. My concern is like, what are you going to get on the mound from him, right? Like he kind of struggled this fall. Fastball was like 89 and 91, maybe got a couple 92, 93s here and there. If he's in the rotation, like I think he could really find some success. Like he can make his way to the two-way player first team for us at the end of the season. But he's a guy I'm definitely going to watch, especially because he's just another bat we didn't even talk about during the Virginia discussion, that he's just going to be placed in like the 4 or 5 hole there for them, and just absolutely going to mash baseball. So that's the guy I'm going with. Last guy I want to touch on, Tyler, since you interviewed Darren Vaught about his docuseries that he has on this player. I think this might be the only freshman we have on a preseason All-American team too. I'd have to double check, but talk about Rintaro Sasaki. Talk about some of that discussion you have with Darren, like what he kind of means for college baseball.
Yeah, I just looking at it from like a outsider standpoint to start, like the Rintaro decision to come to America and play college baseball has the chance to be a gigantic stepping stone for Japanese players that, want to have easier access to get to the majors. MPB is obviously very different. Listening to Darren's podcast, it's like a lottery style pick with the draft over there. There was some I can't remember the name of the player, but like they had something like 17 bid in for him for like the first overall pick a few years ago. which is wild for me to think about. But that's just the way that they operate over there. And seeing not only him but Maury that's signed with the Oakland A's, or I guess the Sacramento A's now, but those two guys are going to have big pieces in how Japanese players and potentially even Korean players too kind of find their way into college ball and take a different route into the majors. So looking at it from there, but then obviously on the college side, like everybody is touted his work ethic. He's a really fantastic kid from the sounds of it. Very smart too. Like he's taking biochemistry as a freshman in college with very limited English experience too. So like, not only are you trying to learn a different language, you're now doing biochemistry at one of the best educational schools in the country. So, work ethics there. I fully believe with the power that he has. You've seen it. Like the power is ridiculously good from the left side of the plate. Maybe some questions with the hit tool, and obviously he's pretty limited first base wise, but like long ball wins a lot of the time. It's very valuable, and if he's able to put up like a 20 home run season as a true freshman in the ACC, I think in and of itself that's a really, really good season to have as your first like getting your feet wet in college baseball.
Yeah, to talk about how big the power is. What, he broke Shohei Ohtani's high school home run record?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. And like the high school had Shohei, I think it was Kikuchi from, I don't know if he's still at Houston now or if he's jumped ship somewhere, but I'm pretty sure Kikuchi was also mentioned in that as well.
Yeah, I love it. Want to wrap up with the third preseason All-American team, and then we'll go with some overarching questions. Jason, looking at this list, it also seems fully loaded. Is there a guy you think's too low, shouldn't be on this third preseason All-American team?
Well, my pick for the preseason player of the year is on this one with Fisher, but I won't. But I'll say Max Bellew.
Yeah.
Just you want to talk about video game numbers? He put up with Texas last year. Now I'll be intrigued to see how that translates to the SEC, but I don't see much of a dip. And so you're talking about a guy who will be the focal point for another stacked roster in the SEC. I think he can very clearly make a push for second and also first team. But yeah, my preseason player of the year, Fisher's the third baseman here, so also clearly that one as well.
I love it. Tyler, what about you?
Just going to put it out there. I had Fisher higher than third team for anybody that cares.
So don't blame me. We'll just keep blaming Monty and Peyton. We'll just keep blaming Monty and Peyton. They're not here and they can't defend themselves, so we're just going to keep putting it on them.
I'm going to get a text from Monty saying HR. But if I had to choose a guy that I think he finishes higher than what we have him here is, I could say Grossi or Conrad to be like boomer ACC picks. Like those two guys obviously are very talented. I could totally see them being up there, but I'm going to go with Colton Smith out of Georgia. Had his struggles last year, obviously, like had to go through kind of like a swingman role to then he got put as a starter late in the year after I think his game against South Carolina, and then against Florida, who ended up being an Omaha team and struck out 12 in 8 innings and just looked dominant. So for me, finding a guy like that, kind of like a diamond in the rough out of your bullpen to now be like a legitimate starter for your team, even with Wes Johnson's, tutelage there. And not to mention their portal lineup this year too is really, really impressive. But with Colton, it's like 2 different fastballs, 2 different breaking balls, has the feel for the changeup. He's going to have that Friday role in Athens this year, and I genuinely am a believer in the fact that he's going to put up big numbers this year. I think that it was something like a 5 some odd ERA last year. I can totally see that being halved, maybe even more than that, with how much of command cleanup there's been over the past few months as well. So I'm very high on Colton Smith.
I love it. Going to go into one more overarching question for each of you on this these preseason All-Americans. Then we'll do one final wrap-up question. So, Jason, for you, there's a lot of transfers on these preseason All-Americans list. Who do you think is going to be able to make the biggest impact on their new team?
Good question. Right now, I'd probably say Jansen at LSU. I think he's probably either their Friday or Saturday night guy. Again, they have Cohen, they have Mayers, they have a lot. So I think sometimes it's difficult because you're not certain who's going to get the most playing time. Killen for Tennessee, I think he's pretty much penciled into the second base spot now. So he's another top 5 portal guy that I think is not just, hey, you're going to be within the battle. I think he's penciled in now. And then you look at some guys who's not on here, like a Beidle Cheese for Arkansas. I'm not sure where he'll land if he's a weekend guy, because I know they really like Gage Wood there. But then they've also got like Zach Root. So I mean, really, I think the hardest thing is trying to understand which of these guys are going to get the most impact. And then you just mentioned with Georgia and their portal guys like Devin Obie. Like, I mean, here's a guy who didn't hop into the portal until I think like October. And so he was a late grad. And so Georgia picked him up super late. And so, how does he impact their offense? And they've got a stacked outfield as well. So, I mean, it's really interesting. And I think it's going to point to a big question mark in the portal is a lot of these individuals who hit the portal, who maybe expected 200 ABs or 50 innings pitched, like, are they actually going to get that? Or are they just going to get like a niche position where they're playing, almost kind of in scenarios rather than an everyday player?
Yeah, I mean, to your point on Beidle Cheese too, I think we had him in the third preseason All-American team, and then we weren't sure about what his role was going to be. So
I think he's going to be their first bullpen guy. I don't even think
Yeah.
he's going to be a weekend. I think it's going to be Wood, Root, and Gackle.
Yeah.
But then the question is, like, McIntyre last year for Arkansas, I think, had like 60 innings pitched.
Yeah.
So I think he can still get that like 40 to 60 innings pitched, even if he's that primary reliever. And they've struggled having, a left-handed pitcher out of the pen for the past few years. They've done really, really well with those first like 6-7 innings, but it's been kind of, all right, how do they get to that back end? We've been talking about depth of pitching. In my opinion, it's LSU, Arkansas, then like a Gully and everybody else. I think their pitching depth is those two teams is far above everybody else. Each of those teams' top 8 arms could be a Friday night guy for the vast majority of teams in Division One.
It's wild. Tyler, question I was going to go to for you. Out of the preseason All-Americans, who has the most to gain or lose in their draft stock?
That's a good one. If I had to say most to gain, probably Arroyo, honestly. Kind of going from a guy that was pretty highly touted out of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, goes to Florida, doesn't really have a role, goes to JUCO route, and is now kind of getting his first, not to say first taste of college baseball, but like he never really had that role with Florida to kind of like push himself into that. Like he's one of the best players in college baseball, but for me, like getting into that Virginia lineup, and I think he's going to do more with the stick than the arm, personally. But for him, this is his chance to kind of like put himself on the map, show that he's a consistent threat in arguably the best lineup in the country. So for me, that would be my pick. I think if anything, for like losing draft stock, I don't want to talk bad about guys. Personally, because I just feel like there's no reason to kind of like sit here and be like, hey, this kid sucks. Let's knock him down a peg. Like I'd rather be constructive with criticism. So I'm gonna kind of give a glimpse into what I want to talk about in the future piece. But like Ethan Petrie for me, you look at the eligible first baseman this year, like Nolan Schubert, Tanner Thack. You maybe throw Henry Ford in there too, but he's gonna be playing outfield this year. But like those 3 guys are all, big boppers, powers to carrying tool, but they're probably playing first base moving forward. And Petrie, for me, the end zone contact wasn't great last year. Chased a lot, really had trouble with velocity up. And for me, I kind of look at that and go, that's a bit of a concern. But he has that power to kind of help him out. He did with the Cape this year, or Cape MVP this year. So I'm not sure how much that MVP is going to weigh in on his evaluations, but if Petry does have a year similar to what he had last year, where the contact's not where you want it to be for a guy that's as touted as he is as a future first rounder, and as on a overall basis, not just me, but like Baseball America, Future Stars, all these guys. For me, I want to see the contact improve. I want to see him prove that he's just not a first baseman. So he's probably got the most to lose out of that. But honestly, like, I again don't want to talk bad about him, but having the power that he has, if you improve the contact, if you can show you're playing right field because he's got the arm for it, that's big for him. Like you shed that first base label and you're moving past that, you're now an outfielder. That improves your stock immensely because defensive first base is not what the calling card is there. So for me, that's what he has to do to kind of improve that. And I'm going to write about it more here soon, but that's kind of the gist of it for Petry is like, prove to me that you're not a first baseman and you can improve the contact. And then for me, that just opens up a wave of doors for you, in my opinion. So I'll go with him.
Yeah, great pick. So for the last question, this is going to be if we're going to put both of you on the spot and myself on the spot. What's one bold prediction for the season? So this can be based on the top 25 rankings. This can be based on the preseason All-American list, or can this going to just be college baseball in general? What is your one bold prediction? And Jason, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of something, and it kind of is a little counterintuitive because it goes against something that you kind of picked as your bold prediction for a positive standpoint. But I think FSU actually struggles a bit this year. So I think Arnold is elite, and I think they got some nice pieces out of portal. That the freshman you mentioned, I've forgotten the name. What was his? He was doing great this fall. Apologies, I forgot. But Evan Crest came from Jacksonville. He was a top 10 portal guy. I don't know if he's nailed down like a weekend spot for them right now. I think Arnold clearly is the best pitcher in D1, but I'm intrigued to see what they do from an offensive perspective because they lost a tremendous amount offensively. And for me, I'm not sure if they've got like a set weekend rotation yet. And so losing all of that offensive power and not having a completely set weekend rotation, I think FSU perhaps struggles a bit this year. That's my bold take that I'm sure is going to be inaccurate because as they all are.
I love it. I was going to say, like, Miles Bailey, I mentioned him as a freshman. Like, yeah, he can hit a ball 500 feet, but the swing and miss concerns, like, what's that going to be like when he faces ACC pitching versus high school pitching? So, Tyler, what about you?
Bold prediction, I think it's going to be true. ACC is better than the SEC. Maybe a bit too bold even for me, but like the way I look at it is the ACC has a rich pool of talent coming into this year. You look at Drew Burris, AJ Gracia as like kind of standouts for what we're looking at like next year, like 2026's draft class is insane. The ACC has a big chunk of that at the top. So, looking at that, Jamie Arnold's obviously in the fray there. I think kind of even looking at like going past Virginia, like Virginia Tech has some good guys. Henry Cook could be a guy that really pops up this year. Kind of look farther down, like Pitt could make some noise. They get Luke Cantwell back and they have some intriguing arms in there. So, for me, when you look at the SEC, like we always talk about the SEC being like the best of the best, like this is where you want to play. It just means more. I'm not trying to say that like I think the SEC is kind of down, but there's a lot more parity in the SEC, and probably not as much depth as what the ACC has. So, kind of just looking at what the ACC has, like obviously I talked about Cal kind of being at the bottom, like Notre Dame probably fits there too, maybe Miami, but kind of just looking at everything else, you have a ton of teams that you look at that and you go, they could either be really, really good or they could have the floor of like, going like over in conference play. But a lot of that is kind of looking at on the positive side. Like, could Pitt surprise and be a really good team this year? I wouldn't be shocked if they could, to be honest with you. So for me, kind of just looking at it from like a depth standpoint, I think the ACC is deeper than the SEC. So that for me, I wouldn't be shocked if the ACC kind of does take that step forward this year with the talent that they have.
And I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to do a second one to kind of add on to your positive vibes. And a very similar mindset. I think the Big 12 this year gets at least 7 teams in. So I think this is a
Interesting.
super deep Big 12 this year.
Yeah.
Arizona's come over. You still have your Oklahoma States and your TCUs that are kind of headliners. Kansas. I think Kansas, for me, is one of the biggest sleepers this year. They had the number 1 JUCO class, the top 10 portal class. Dominic Vagley's coming back. I really like UCF, Cincinnati, Kansas. I mean, they go 11 deep of like, hey, this team could make noise. So I really feel like the Big 12 is pretty slept on this year. While I would be very surprised if it's not a very ACC, SEC concentrated Omaha. I do think that if there's a who could break through, I think the Big 12 is one of those. That and maybe Oregon, because Oregon joins the Big 10, and like the Big 10 hasn't had a super regional host since 2015.
Yeah.
And the NCAA, not that a top 8 national seed, that is, that the NCAA wants to expand out of the southeastern corridor and go further west. And so they would love to see another Big 10 team take off. So those are my 2 kind of positives outliers, as I think Oregon is set up really, really well. I really like their team. And I think the Big 12 is there's, as we talked about, the SEC, ACC, and then everybody else. I think the Big 12 will push for kind of that very prominent 3rd spot.
I love that.
I'll add on to your Big 10 point. I think the Big 10's as deep as it's ever been.
Yeah.
Personally, like, kind of look at it: Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, Oregon. You mentioned that's a really, really good top of the spear there. So
Ohio State just got Campbell's new head coach, and I think they're going to do really well. It's a much, and with all of these conference realignments, I was looking at it. I think Oregon has when they play Maryland. So I think they've got like a 5,400-mile round trip weekend series. And so it's like, how in the world are all these like different travels going to impact? Because it doesn't travel go into RPI, like distance from, I don't know how that will work because it's in conference. But I don't know. For me, how will the selection committee handle all of the chaos of mega teams, of Oregon State not being in a conference, of Stanford having to go to Miami, or if they're playing Miami, unsure. I mean, you've got all of these just crazy schedules this year, and how is that going to be impacted? And I love that there's been such a push for these round robin tournaments now, and it feels like they're everywhere now. And so really you kind of get to see whose teams kind of are a step above. I remember seeing Tennessee last year. I think it was at the Shriners that first weekend in Arlington. I texted one of the SEC coaches, and I was just like, it's absurd. The bats they had, it was just every single ball was 105 plus. I couldn't believe it. Every single one.
I love that point about Oregon, because I was putting my schedule together and I was like, oh, they got 3 games against Maryland and then an 11 a.m. game against Georgetown on Monday. So they're going to be flying out after that Georgetown game. Yeah. It's nuts.
And they play a 4-game series with Oregon State. So the Civil War, continues. But it's just a weird schedule.
Yeah, and I think Stanford and like Cal had the same thing, where like they opened the ACC weekend at UNC and Duke respectively. Then obviously all the ACC, the East Coast teams kind of go out to them, but then they end the year, they end conference play with like Stanford goes to NC State. I think Cal still comes back out here. And then they obviously had the ACC tournament in Durham this year. So like they'll be out here more than once, and they'll also have like a week and a half period of just like, hey, you're on the complete, opposite side of the country, 3-hour time difference. How does jet lag affect you as a player that late into the season? So that's going to be interesting this year.
Yeah. Well, that kind of wraps it up for us. The top 25, the preseason rankings. We're really excited for this season. I think next week we're going to have a college baseball season preview coming out. Jason, before we wrap up, just kind of plug all that you're doing and where everybody can find all your stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're 64analytics.com. I would say our bread and butter is the portal, but we're really trying to jump into more of an objective rankings of individuals. So we talked about a lot of subjectivity here today, which is always a lot of fun, but kind of just jumping into the more of the nuts and bolts behind how an individual is ranked when it comes to comparatively within Division One. It's always kind of fun to talk about, an individual sabermetric numbers, but when you talk about some places where it's 350 to center, sometimes it's hard to justify differentiations between OPS. So we like to have fun going into the nerding out of the stats, and we've really enjoyed working a lot with the programs. So we had, I think, 42, 43 programs last year, and we're growing rapidly. We were at the ABCAs this year. Jared, saw you there. And it was really neat presenting and kind of just talking about the inflection point in which the sport is currently at, because you had 5,000 guys in the portal last year, and we're assuming it's probably going to be closer to 7 with adjustments from 40 roster spots down to 34. And I mean, it's going to be wild. I mean, the amount of individuals that are changing hats. I mean, my guy was the preseason player of the year. He was at Duke, then he was at Ole Miss, now he's at Tennessee. So it's kind of just this musical chairs of talent. And when the music stops, like, are you going to have your full roster? Or are you going to be looking with question marks?
I love it. And I can attest, and I think Tyler can too. We've used your resource a ton, and it's just an awesome database. So check it out. If you're listening to this, it's at 64analytics.com. And I think you can find everything there. It's really, really cool. But yeah, for us, we got some interviews coming. We had Coach Muscara from Wake Forest on recently. We have an interview coming up with Auburn's associate head coach, Gabe Gross. We'll have a bunch of conference previews leading up to the season and all these other fun stuff. So until next time, we'll see you.